Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corn. So like most people in Israel, I was following the aftermath of October 7th online pretty closely and saw many of the, just horrible videos that emerged on Telegram channels and in the news after the attacks. A lot during that period, another type of footage that emerged was some interrogation videos that were released by Israel's internal security organization, the Shin Bet, and those actually kind of made an impression on me because I guess when we're thinking and talking about the type of person that would have participated in the stuff that Hamas did in Israel on that day, which was barbaric and horrible and revolting and disgusting, and all the words that you could possibly summon aren't enough to describe it. But that, when you think about someone who engages in that kind of thing, you begin to conjure a mental image of them. Maybe, the personification of evil. And when you think about the job of the interrogators who had to, when these individuals were in Israeli custody, and some of them were, I think several hundred terrorists who broke into Israel. I mean, it was a huge onslaught, and some terrorists in fact evaded capture for several hundred days, which is remarkable. But the majority were either killed or returned to Gaza or captured in the first few days after October the 7th. And the ISA released a subset of their interrogations, and this really challenged for me everything I would have assumed about the context in which this kind of thing happened. By which I mean, you'd assume that the interrogators were incredibly angry, incensed, repulsed, outraged, and that the people that were on the other side of the table would be, I don't know, the personification of evil. And instead, the videos depicted the captives speaking pretty nonchalantly about what they did, and the interrogators who were off camera typing it efficiently into a keyboard. You didn't see them, but you could hear the typing of you could see their monitor was blurred for security reasons, but you could see that they were kind of, you could see the movement of a hand on the mouse, typing the details in, asking the questions. So nothing about the actual interrogation. And we have to, of course, talk about whenever law enforcement and intelligence organization releases footage like this in the public domain, we have to ask why. And I don't think it's cynical to assume that this may not necessarily be representative of the whole. But nevertheless, there's no shortage of footage like this on the internet. This may be a more extreme example, but the act of interrogation happens on a daily basis in police stations around the world for much more mundane and ordinary things than the national security crimes that were committed in this context. And those who are engaged in this, I've read there's some interesting material about how interrogation actually works. The use of torture is illegal in almost all the world. And modern interrogation is much more a battle of brain than of brawn and shouting and banging of desks. So I'd love to ask about that, Herman and Corn. It's interesting, the work of these interrogators, because everything has to be done according to the law. There is, even when we talk about things like torture, I believe they've been shown to lead to false confessions. And this type of interrogation that actually is carried out in interrogation rooms every day, what kind of background do the interrogators have? And what kind of techniques are actually used and allowed to be used by the law? Because there's only so much, if we're all talking about things happening in the context of talking, it's a game of psychology at the end of the day. So Herman and Corn, let's talk about interrogation in 2026 in today's episode of My Weird Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am here in our home in Jerusalem with my brother,
Herman Poppleberry, at your service. And today we are tackling a topic that hits very close to home for us, especially living where we do.
Yeah, our housemate Daniel sent us a really thoughtful prompt this week. He has been watching those interrogation videos released by the Shin Bet following the October 7th attacks. He was struck by the contrast between the horrific nature of the crimes being described and the almost casual, nonchalant way the captives were talking about them. And on the other side, the very efficient, professional conduct of the interrogators.
It is a jarring contrast. You expect a high-tension, cinematic interrogation with people screaming and desks being slammed, but the reality is often much quieter and, in a way, much more chilling. Daniel wanted us to look into the background of these interrogators and the specific techniques they use, especially within the bounds of the law.
It is a fascinating deep dive into psychology and law. I mean, we see the headlines, but we rarely think about the person sitting across the table from a terrorist, trying to extract life-saving information while maintaining their own composure.
Right. To understand this, we have to start with the organization itself. The Shin Bet, or the Israel Security Agency, is often called the Shabak in Hebrew. Their motto is Magen Velo Yerai, which translates to Defender who shall not be seen. They handle internal security, which includes counter-terrorism. The interrogation unit is a very specialized branch within that.
Right, and they are not just recruiting anyone off the street. Herman, what does the profile of a Shin Bet interrogator actually look like?
It is much more academic than people might think. They are looking for people with high emotional intelligence, linguistic fluency, and a deep understanding of cultural nuances. Most of these interrogators are fluent in Arabic, not just the language, but the specific dialects, the slang, the religious references, and the social structures of the region. Many are recruited from elite intelligence units like Unit 8200, but they undergo years of additional training in behavioral psychology.
That makes sense. If you cannot speak the language of the person across from you, you are already at a massive disadvantage. But it is more than just language, right? It is about empathy, or at least the projection of it.
That is the key thing. To be a top-tier interrogator, you have to be able to build a bridge to someone who may have done something unthinkable. You have to understand their motivations, their fears, and their family dynamics. Many interrogators have degrees in psychology, sociology, or political science. They are trained to read body language, microexpressions, and speech patterns. They are essentially professional psychologists who happen to work in a high-stakes security environment.
But let us talk about that nonchalance Daniel mentioned. I saw those videos too. These guys are describing atrocities while leaning back in their chairs, sometimes even smiling. What is happening there psychologically?
There are a few things at play. First, there is the concept of moral disengagement. If someone has been radicalized or told for years that their victims are not fully human, they can discuss their actions without the typical weight of guilt that a person in a normal society would feel. But also, the interrogators are trained to create an environment where the captive feels it is safe, or even beneficial, to talk.
So, if the interrogator stays calm and professional, it might actually encourage the captive to be more open.
Yes. If the interrogator reacts with visible horror or anger, the captive might shut down or feel a sense of power. By staying neutral and efficient, the interrogator maintains control of the room. It becomes a business transaction. Information for comfort, or information for a sense of importance. The interrogator often adopts the role of a neutral observer or even a pseudo-confidant.
That is an interesting point. Some of these captives might actually want to brag about what they did because, in their world, it makes them a hero.
And that is often the case. The interrogator might play into that ego. They might say, "Tell me how you did it. You were the leader of this group, right? You were the one who made it happen." And the captive, wanting to validate their status, spills the details. This is part of the move away from physical force toward cognitive techniques like the strategic use of evidence, or SUE.
Let us get into the legal side of that. Because historically, when people think of interrogation, they think of torture. But you mentioned that modern interrogation is more of a psychological battle. What is the legal framework for the Shin Bet here in Israel?
This is a huge area of legal history. For a long time, there was a lot of ambiguity. In 1987, the Landau Commission report was published. It actually allowed for the use of moderate physical pressure in certain circumstances. But that changed significantly in 1999.
That was a landmark ruling by the High Court of Justice, right?
Well, in the case of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel versus the Government of Israel, the court ruled that the Shin Bet did not have the authority to use physical means like shaking, the shack position where someone is tied in a painful way, or sleep deprivation as a method of breaking someone. The court said that an interrogation must be free of torture and cruel or inhuman treatment.
But there is a caveat, isn't there? The necessity defense.
There is. This is the ticking time bomb scenario. The court acknowledged that in an immediate, life-threatening situation where information is needed to prevent an imminent attack, an interrogator might use certain measures and then claim the necessity defense under Section 34.11 of the penal law in court later. But it is not a pre-authorized license. It is an after-the-fact legal defense that is strictly scrutinized by the Ministry of Justice.
So, in the case of the October 7th interrogations, most of what we are seeing is happening well after the immediate threat of those specific individuals has passed. They are in custody, the attack has happened. So, the focus shifts to intelligence gathering for future operations and for the legal record.
Correct. And that is why the techniques are so heavily weighted toward the psychological. One of the most effective methods used globally now, which the Shin Bet is known to utilize, is called the Scharff technique.
Named after Hans Scharff, the German interrogator from World War II?
That is right. Scharff was famous for never using violence. He would take prisoners for walks, bring them tea, and talk to them like friends. He would pretend he already knew everything and was just filling in the blanks.
Right. The illusion of knowing. If I think you already know the answer, I am much more likely to confirm it or add a detail because I do not feel like I am giving anything away.
That is the principle. The modern version of this involves a few core pillars. First, a friendly, non-coercive approach. Second, the illusion of knowing. Third, confirmation and disconfirmation. Instead of asking, "What is your unit's name?" the interrogator might say, "So when you were in the northern unit, you did this and that, right?" If the person corrects them and says, "No, I was in the southern unit," they have just given up a piece of information without even realizing it was a question.
It is like a high-stakes version of a con artist's cold reading. You provide enough detail to seem informed, and the other person naturally wants to correct the record or fill in the gaps.
And it works so much better than pain. Research has shown over and over that people under physical duress will say anything to make the pain stop. They will lie, they will make up stories, they will give you false leads. But if you build rapport, if you use cognitive techniques, the information you get is much more likely to be accurate.
I think that is a vital point for our listeners. We often see movies where the hero beats the information out of the villain in 5 seconds. In reality, that information would probably be useless. The Shin Bet needs actionable intelligence. If a captive says a tunnel is at point A, but it is actually at point B, soldiers could die. Accuracy is more important than the catharsis of punishment.
That is exactly how the professionals look at it. They view their job as an extraction of data, not an act of retribution. They have to keep their own emotions completely separate from the task. Imagine sitting across from someone who just described doing something horrific to a family, and your job is to calmly ask, "And then what did you do?" It requires an incredible amount of mental discipline.
I imagine they have a lot of support for that, right? The psychological toll on the interrogator must be massive.
It is. They have regular debriefings and psychological support. You cannot stare into that kind of darkness every day without it affecting you. But back to the techniques, there is also the concept of cognitive load.
Oh, I have heard of this in the context of lie detection. Tell me how it works in an interrogation room.
Well, lying is much harder for the brain than telling the truth. You have to remember what you said, make sure it is consistent, and suppress the truth. An interrogator will increase that cognitive load by asking the person to tell their story in reverse order, or by asking very specific, unexpected questions about minor details.
Like, what was the weather like that morning? Or what color was the door?
Yes, precisely. If you are telling the truth, you can usually access those sensory memories. If you are lying, you have to invent them on the spot, and that takes mental energy. Eventually, the lie starts to crack. The interrogator just waits for those cracks and then gently probes them.
It is a war of attrition, but it is happening inside the captive's head.
That is a good way to put it. And there is also the social element. Many of these captives come from a culture where honor and family are paramount. An interrogator might talk about the captive's mother or their children, not necessarily as a threat, but as a way to ground them in a reality outside of the conflict. They might say, "Your mother would not want to see you like this," or "What kind of future are you leaving for your kids?"
It is about finding a lever. Everyone has a lever. For some, it is religion. For others, it is family. For some, it is just their own ego and wanting to be remembered.
And the Shin Bet interrogators are masters at finding that lever quickly. They spend the first few hours or even days just building a profile. They observe how the person eats, how they sleep, what makes them nervous, what makes them relax. By the time the real questioning begins, the interrogator often knows the captive better than the captive knows themselves.
We should also mention the role of technology. Daniel mentioned hearing the typing in the background of those videos. They are recording everything, not just for the confession, but for data analysis.
Right. They are likely using software to cross-reference every name, every location, and every date mentioned with their existing database. If a captive mentions a person named Ahmad from a specific neighborhood, the system might flag 5 different Ahmads who fit that profile. The interrogator can then pivot and ask about one of them specifically, again creating that illusion of knowing.
It is a massive, multi-layered operation. It is not just 2 guys in a room. It is a room backed by an entire intelligence infrastructure.
And that is why it looks so efficient. It is a factory of information. But I want to go back to the nonchalance Daniel mentioned, because I think there is one more layer to it. In some of these cases, the captives are in a state of shock, even if it does not look like it. Their world has completely collapsed. They went from being part of a massive attack to being in a sterile cell.
So, talking might be a way of reclaiming some sense of self.
Yes. When you are in a cell, you are a number. When you are being interrogated, you are a person again. Someone is listening to you. Someone is interested in your story. For a certain type of personality, that is very seductive. They start talking because it feels better than the silence of the cell.
That is a dark bit of psychology, but it makes total sense. Now, let us talk about the ethics and the public release of these videos. Why do you think the Shin Bet released them? Daniel mentioned that it might not be representative of the whole process.
Well, it is definitely a strategic choice. Usually, the Shin Bet keeps everything behind a veil of secrecy. Releasing these videos serves a few purposes. First, it provides evidence to the world of what happened on October 7th, coming directly from the mouths of the perpetrators. It is hard to deny an atrocity when the person who committed it is describing it in detail.
It is a counter to misinformation.
It certainly is. Second, it shows the Israeli public that the security services are doing their job, that people are being caught and held accountable. And third, it serves as a psychological deterrent. It says to others, if you do this, we will find you, we will catch you, and you will end up in this room talking to us.
But as Daniel pointed out, we are seeing the polished version. We are seeing the moments where they are talking. We are not seeing the hundreds of hours of silence, or the frustration, or the legal battles that happen behind the scenes.
Right. We have to be careful not to mistake the edited highlights for the entire reality. Interrogation is often boring. It is hours of repetitive questions, checking and rechecking details. It is tedious work.
I think it is also important to touch on the international law aspect. Israel is often under a microscope regarding its treatment of detainees. How does the Shin Bet's process hold up under international scrutiny?
It is a constant point of contention. Human rights organizations often criticize the lack of transparency and the use of administrative detention. However, the Shin Bet argues that their methods are within the bounds of Israeli law, which they claim is aligned with international standards for preventing immediate threats. The 1999 ruling was a major step in that direction, but the debate over where the line is between pressure and torture is one that continues in every democracy.
It is a thin line, and it seems like the goal of these modern techniques is to stay as far away from that line as possible, while still being effective. Because if you cross it, you lose the information's credibility in court, and you lose the moral high ground.
That is absolutely right. In the 21st century, information is the most valuable currency, and you get the best information through sophisticated psychology, not through a rubber hose. That is the fundamental shift in modern intelligence.
So, to answer Daniel's question, these interrogators are highly educated, culturally fluent, and psychologically trained professionals. They use rapport building, cognitive load management, and the illusion of knowing to extract information. And they do it within a legal framework that has moved steadily away from physical force towards psychological expertise.
It is a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying field of work. The level of self-control required is just staggering. You are basically a human lie detector and a therapist rolled into one, working for a national security agency.
I wonder if artificial intelligence is going to change this. I mean, we are in February 2026 now. We are seeing artificial intelligence being used for everything. Do you think we will ever see an artificial intelligence interrogator?
It is an interesting thought. Artificial intelligence can already analyze microexpressions and voice stress levels better than most humans. We are already seeing systems that can flag inconsistencies in real time for the interrogator. But I think the rapport building part, the human-to-human connection, is something an artificial intelligence cannot replicate yet. You need that shared sense of humanity, even if it is a manipulated one, to get someone to open up.
Yeah, I think you are right. There is something about the soul of another person being present that changes the dynamic. You cannot really feel shame or pride in front of a computer in the same way you do in front of a man who is looking you in the eye.
You are absolutely right. It is the ultimate human game.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.